Hey everyone, you are on the 14th Step, a podcast about addiction and recovery. My name is Mark. I'm a professional counselor and a recovering addict.
My name is Skip. I'm a recovering addict and a recovery coach.
If you're watching on YouTube, please leave us a comment. What you have to say matters to us. We would love to hear your own story about addiction or recovery, and we would also love to feature that on a future podcast.
Absolutely. You know, we've had a lot of comments and reaction to some of the videos that we've touched on types of addictions and talked about some different things. So is that what we're gonna go a little bit more in depth on maybe one of those today?
I think it's really interesting to talk about other kinds of addictions rather than drugs and alcohol, because there's also kind of questions about whether it actually exists or not. These other kinds of addictions, other than gambling addiction, that's the only one that's officially recognized by the diagnostic people.
Wow. Okay. So do they call the other ones maybe obsessions?
They don't really call them anything. I think there's a lot of research on it.
Okay.
But it's this kind of gray area as to what actually is an addiction.
Very interesting.
And what's not an addiction.
Yeah, because I think in some ways we've touched on this before. Maybe it hits parts of the brain that a chemical addiction would, but there's a whole lot of other aspects to it that people can say it may not be as harmful. So you're getting into that 50% one way, half dozen the other way. I don't even know what I'm saying.
50% the other way.
Yeah, 50% one way, 10% the other way.
Lucky for you.
For a grand total of 60.
I did a little research.
You did? Okay.
Which means I searched Google.
Let's hear it, because
the most cursory
obviously
search
my
of
strong spot is math.
So I looked at Google and the first thing on there, and it said that harmful video game playing.
Video games?
Yeah, that's what I was looking at. I was looking at video game addiction and what's considered harmful and what's not. And this said that about 3 hours a day or more is considered to be on the edge of harmful video game playing. And when I read that, I was like, amateurs. 3 hours. So I do more video gaming before most people do at 9 a.m. And so it also had a list of symptoms, which I always take with a grain of salt. I mean, the symptoms are right, but it doesn't really point to the problem.
Well, do you remember a couple of weeks ago we did a video and we talked about the definition of addiction? And I'm not even sure, but we said if it affects your job, if it affects your livelihood, if it affects your relationships, if it, takes away your hobbies, and we were kind of defining, well, video games can do all that, right?
So
it can hit all those points.
Easy. It can consume your life. You prioritize it at the expense of everything else. What this said was that problematic and excessive video game playing is associated with maladaptive coping strategies, which I guess would be like you're coping with life on a video game, negative emotions and attitudes, low self-esteem, loneliness, and poor academic performance. So I can see the poor academic performance because there's a whole bunch of like college students playing video games rather than studying. But what I really thought was interesting was low self-esteem and loneliness. I am willing to bet that someone who is prone to playing video games for 8 or 9 hours a day already has low self-esteem and is already lonely before they ever, that's the draw of the video game, is because they already have low self-esteem and they're already lonely.
Right. And I would venture to wager that the video games that they play are social and fantasy, or that they can be a different character.
Yes. That is 100% true. When I think about people that have an addiction, and I'm going to go ahead and call this an addiction because I think that it is, just as much as a drug addiction or a drinking or anything else. I think we have to talk about it and understand the issue, because I think if we don't understand what the issue actually is, we don't have compassion towards the human being that's doing it. Because it's easy to say that someone who plays Warcraft 10 hours a day is lazy, unmotivated, And that's stigma to me. And perpetuating that kind of thing is what keeps people sick and not getting better. And plus, I don't think it's really fair to say that someone who does anything for 10 hours a day is unmotivated. I mean, they're motivated to do that.
Can I tell you how perfect of an example that is? I was in the throes of, taking pills in my addiction, and I would come in and get mad at the world that my son is playing a video game for 3 hours. You know what I mean? Yeah. I mean, that's what you're talking about. I'm like sitting there in the middle of my addiction going, I'm going to take that PS3 and throw that thing in the dumpster and you'll never see it. You know what I mean?
It's frustrating to be a parent and witness your child basically wasting away doing something like that.
Even if you're wasting away doing
even
something.
If you are too. And that's that denial stuff with it. I mean, we have blinders to our own stuff, obviously. I want to talk about the driving force behind a video game addiction, and I want to link it to some other things and how they're similar.
Good.
Because I think that a video game addiction at its core is the same as a sex addiction. I think is the same as a porn addiction or even like an alcohol addiction, because those things, what they have in common is that they allow us to be a version of ourselves that we are more comfortable being. And it lets us live kind of in a fantasy world. And that has a big draw to people who are unsure of themselves naturally, or who have a hard time with their own emotional state or regulating that.
And would you say it takes some of those things take away your inhibitions, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, in online gaming, the ones that are, and I'm going to use Warcraft, World of Warcraft as an example, is kind of the quintessential online game that people play a lot of. And there's 100 just like it, but it allows you to be whoever you want to be. Yeah. And you can kind of hide behind the anonymity of whatever character that you've created. It's always kind of an ideal version of yourself, and then you can live out the life that you want to live.
Yeah. And it goes into depth.
Oh.
I mean, you can buy, sell, or trade on there. You can be a warrior. You can be
whatever you want to be.
Anything.
And you can be whatever you want to be without the natural insecurity that you might have in a real human interaction. And just go on a YouTube video or a forum and read the comments. You know how brave people are in internet comments? People say things in comments that they would never say to a person's face because it's anonymous, because it's comfortable. And there's not that fear of rejection. You don't have the same insecurities.
No real world consequences.
There's no real world consequences.
And they can so therefore they can experiment and see what sticks.
Well, yeah.
And what clicks in their brain to go, man, I get the most satisfaction from this, so they can keep pushing it, and there's no consequences.
The draw of being able to remake yourself into what you want to be, a version of yourself that exists in your mind, that's the same to me as someone with an alcohol problem, because being drunk kind of allows you to be the version of yourself that you're comfortable with. You feel more confident, you feel more secure, less afraid, you feel more social.
I always heard, somebody always says that alcohol just takes what you are and multiplies it about times 10.
It does.
So deep down, if you're a angry person and you have a problem with alcohol, it'll make you an extremely angry person. Or if you're, does that make sense? What I'm saying makes sense?
Whatever inhibitions that you have just fly out the window.
Yeah.
And even though that's a mess, there's also something liberating about that to people who feel very unsure of themselves anyway.
Confidence in a bottle.
Yeah, that feels freeing. And so no wonder people want to do that in a social situation. And I've talked to plenty of guys, when they stop drinking, they are terrified of doing social things without having that, fallback.
Right. I can see that.
I think about these addictions, and actually I think about all addictions in the terms of human relationships.
Yes.
All people exist in relationship to one another. Nobody exists just as an island. everything flows from our relationships with other people. And addiction is essentially a safer relationship than actual human contact. My game character that I've made relating to other characters in a game, or my relationship with fantasy sex through porn or whatever, or even my relationship to alcohol, those are all relationships that I can have that feel safer than a human encounter in which I can get rejected. And so, again, and I, at the risk of repeating myself, I kind of want to just shout this from the rooftops. It's like people who are drawn to that have this sensitivity to rejection.
Right.
And the fear of rejection really comes down to having a distrust of other people.
Yeah.
And having a distrust of yourself. We don't trust ourselves to be good enough to relate to others without being rejected, because there's already that self-rejection that's there.
Yeah. On some level, we think that we have deficiency, and that whatever we use helps us to forget that.
Exactly.
or heal. We think it's healing that deficiency or filling that void. I called it a hole in your soul earlier this week. We have this hole, and we're filling it with whatever we can, and that's not the answer. The answer is to figure out what the hole is from.
And what is that hole but the desire to have relationships with other people?
That's it.
It really, and on the most simple level,
fulfilled.
It boils down to being loved.
That's it.
That's the fundamental human desire.
It is. Period. That's what we were created for.
That's exactly right. And if we fear that from a normal human interaction, from a social interaction, we're going to find it in a different way, or we're going to find something that gives us that artificially.
Can I tell you a little sidebar that illustrates that?
Yeah.
I've watched this thing that I've never seen before. Tom Hanks was doing an interview, and the guy was asking him these serious questions about the movie Castaway. And he was talking about how they made that movie, and it's not like what you think, okay? But they got to the part of Wilson, the volleyball.
The volleyball, yeah.
That wasn't even in the script, okay? And they started talking, and they realized he started saying that this guy would have never lasted that long without a person or someone to be in a relationship with. Because if you remember, that's why they put in the scene where they didn't ever show him do it, but they showed the tree where he tried to hang himself, and he threw a dummy and it broke the tree, so he didn't kill himself. And right after that, he found Wilson, and then none of that came into play because he was in a relationship with something. And one of the most powerful scenes in the movie is where he loses him and he's crying, but it's a metaphor, as he didn't need him anymore because he was going to be rescued. And that so goes into what you're saying. You know what I mean? And that was an accident that they hit on that in the movie, and it ended up being one of the most powerful threads of that movie.
Because it speaks to anyone who's watching that, because we all have that basic need to have a connection with somebody else. And that's survival. We don't survive
at the base level.
We do not survive without connection to others. And so when that ability to connect with another person is wounded in some way, that is a wound that's going to carry with someone all the way up until they find something that fills that hole.
And numbs it or something.
Right. And when does that wound happen? I mean, if you think about little kids, let's say they get rejected by their parents. And if you're 3 or 4 years old and you're neglected or abused or otherwise rejected, a 3 or 4-year-old doesn't really understand that they are a separate individual as their parent.
Right.
They don't realize that. And so a rejection from the parent feels like a self-rejection.
Or it's their fault.
Right. When parents divorce, what do kids always say,
My fault.
That's right. And then if the rejection happens in adolescence, when peer relationships are really becoming more and more vital.
I can't trust anybody.
Right, because our identity when we're adolescents and teenagers is tied to our relationship with our peers.
That's it.
That's the phases that kids go through trying to find their place in the world.
I don't fit in.
Right.
What's wrong with me that they don't accept me?
And so that is a self-rejection, because adolescents and teenagers are not very good at not blaming themselves for being rejected. It's hard to look at the person that's doing the rejecting and say, oh, that's just their issue.
No, we look at things, in adolescence, we look at things backwards. We look at things that we take our differences and they're negative because we want to fit in. But when you get older, you realize what makes you different is what makes you special. And you cannot tell that to a 13-year-old, to an 18-year-old.
Because 13 and 18-year-olds are all still naturally self-centered.
Yep.
And they are self-centered because they rely on their parents for their survival in a lot of ways. A wound that happens at that young age creates a chronic sense of self-rejection, which is a chronic sense of loneliness. And it ends up feeling that we are somehow different, unique, that we can never truly participate in life, that everyone else is kind of having an easy time and we're just kind of on the edge looking in. And I think that's probably the problem that links together any kind of addiction that there is, because addiction presents, whether it's online gaming or whether it's whatever it might be, alcohol or drugs, it presents a safer way of connecting to something
without the risks
of rejection. But I think if we understand it like that, we can start to find solutions for it rather than just saying, oh, you just need to stop.
Yeah.
Because telling someone that they need to stop, or you play video games for 10 hours a day, you need to just stop that and, get some sunlight.
Yeah.
What you're asking that person to do is to give up the only safe relationship that they have in a lot of instances.
I'm glad you said that, because that's where that whole empathy thing
that
I've mentioned, that I used to not have much of it. And going through recovery myself, my empathy levels have gone way up, because I understand now what that means, and that everybody's story is unique and separate, and you have to address it from their own situation, and you can't just throw a blanket over it and say one thing to everybody. And we said this before, it's like the world of obsession of addiction is like a big bowl of spaghetti, and you've got to, the first step is finding one end and start working yourself through it. You're not going to just straighten it out.
No, you're not.
It's like my Christmas lights in a box in the garage. When I'm getting ready to go put those out, I know it's going to be a long December.
That's right. And you can't just take the whole tangled mess out of the box and just throw it at the house and expect the house to be decorated. No, and that's kind of like having someone who is addicted to something and then telling them to just put it down. Just throw it away. It'll be fine.
It is a siege.
It is.
It is a mountain. It is the hardest thing you'll ever do, but the most worthy thing you'll ever do.
The best thing that we can do is find other recovering addicts.
That's it.
Find other addicts who are recovered and listen to what they have to say, because they will understand what you're going through. And that in and of itself will become, for some addicts, the first safe connection.
It is.
That they find outside of their addiction. And that is, in a lot of ways, that first little thread.
It is.
That you can start to pull on and unravel some of that stuff, because now you have a safe social connection with a real person that really cares.
That's right. And that's part of the problem that got you there in the first place, is you don't have social connections that you can really trust or rely on.
You may not really believe that anybody would care about you.
Right.
Your real self.
Your real person. That's right.
And so then when you go and you find someone who's in kind of the same boat, recovering addict or whatever, in a meeting, you realize that real part of you is what gives you value to that person.
I'm going to throw another movie out, because I'm the worst pop culture reference person ever. Do you remember the movie, I'm going to I cannot believe, I just was watching this series. It's the one where the humans build these giant robots and two people get inside
Pacific Rim.
Pacific Rim. Follow me here. The way two people run that whole thing is their brains, in sci-fi, their brains mesh together to where one of them controls the left hemisphere, the other one does the right. but they know every thought in the other person's brain, so they have to be compatible. That's why it was brothers, or that's why it's twins, or that's why it's father and son, right? My thought when I watched that movie when it came out is the most terrifying thing that I could ever think of in the world is somebody that would know everything that's in my brain, because they would sit in a corner backwards, hugging themselves, sucking their thumb, going, "What is this?"
I know.
You know what I'm saying? Can you imagine being that vulnerable? Sorry, I can't even say the word.
I cannot imagine that.
No!
That is an awful thought. But see, I'm an addict. And so the worst fear to me is someone knowing what's actually in my head. Because I have spent years trying to very carefully curate my own persona as, when I'm relating to another person.
That's right.
And so...
Oh, I manipulate the space around me on a daily basis.
Right.
And I'm clean. And you know what I mean?
I know.
That's one of my...
And that's why I still go to meetings.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if I don't go to meetings and have that kind of frank discussion with other people where it's just kind of raw, I will very easily go back into that hiding and just manipulate everyone that I come across.
And secrets.
And then no one will ever really know who I am.
That's right. Yep. And
then I'm going to play Warcraft for 10 hours a day.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And then it goes back into the whole thing of isolation, and it's impossible to find the end of the spaghetti to start unraveling because it gets hidden again.
That's exactly right. If you guys have had experience with online gaming addiction or any other kind of addiction, please comment below.
Yep.
Tell us your story. Send us an email. We would love to feature you on a future podcast episode.
Yes. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.